Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula. I'm Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ, and I'm joined as always by Rob from F1 Fantasy Hub. Rob, I don't know about you, but I needed that week off to get the stink from Jeddah out of my mind so I could focus on the comeback in Australia this week.
Yeah, it has been a little while. It's our first 2 week break of this season, and it has probably been a little bit of a welcome break for us after a pretty disastrous first couple of weeks. So I'm looking forward to reconnecting and hopefully an improved result for us both heading into Australia.
It's going to be another action-packed show for us this week. You can see we've got a lot on the agenda, and something that's not there for you is we have a special surprise later in the show, so I'm really looking forward to sharing that with all of you. Rob, let's start with a review of our league. Still running 90,000 teams strong, and you can see there are a few teams at the top that have used multiple chips to get an early advantage.
Yeah, it's definitely been a pretty fast start for a number of teams this season. We've seen a lot of extra DRS boosts, a lot of limitless uses, given they're the two most powerful chips to get ahead in the ranks early on. But as we've stressed in every episode so far this season, and we'll continue to stress, it's going to be a very long season. So plenty of time for all of us to catch up, especially you and I languishing in the 300,000s. But I'm not too worried. It's a long season, as we say, and as long as we deploy those chips effectively at the right times, I think we'll be in good stead for the rest of the year.
Yeah, I looked at all of the top teams in this view here. They all used the 3x DRS boost in Bahrain and the limitless chip last time out at Jeddah. So we're all going to have these chips, save them for a sprint race, and I think we're going to make some big ground on them later in the season.
Definitely, definitely.
Next up, it's our usual topic of the weekly giveaway from Fifth Gear Garms. One lucky winner that posts the answer to the following question in our FanAmp base will win a $25 gift card to our sponsor this week. And our question is, will a Ferrari driver win Driver of the Day? And if not, who will take down the award? And Rob, we asked this question because Carlos Sainz's car has produced the Driver of the Day winner in the first two races.
Yeah, it's been an unbelievable start for Sainz/Behrman owners through two races. I think particularly because Behrman as a rookie came onto the grid, secured a points finish, and just had a very mature drive throughout. So if he's able to replicate anything like that in Australia, I would definitely expect he's in the box seat for a back-to-back Driver of the Day nomination. What do you think?
I don't want to spoil one of our segments a little bit later on, but I'm thinking a Ferrari driver is looking good to win it this week. Leclerc has a very good history at this track. If Behrman performs well in his second F1 race, he could go for back-to-back Driver of the Day. And oh boy, if Carlos Sainz comes back after only 2 weeks, it would definitely be a sentimental opportunity for him to claim Driver of the Day for himself.
Definitely. And I think as well, with so much Red Bull fatigue setting in around in terms of Driver of the Day voting and how people perceive Max and Checo as the candidates for that voting, it definitely seems if Charles or Carlos or Ollie have a race that puts them very close to winning, or in Ollie's case, just scoring points, I think they're a fair shout for that outcome.
And that's a great segment to the winners and losers section because my first winner is the Wonder Kid, Ollie Behrman. He finished P7 on short notice, spelling Carlos Sainz, and he's the youngest driver ever for Ferrari and the third youngest driver to score points in a Grand Prix. So it was a very great result for Ollie in his first race. He was the fourth highest scoring driver in F1 Fantasy with 26 points, thanks to that Driver of the Day, like you mentioned a moment ago. But he also tied Kevin Magnussen for the lead with 6 overtakes. So he's proving his confidence in that car, and a really tremendous result for him and his fantasy owners.
Yeah, a great result for Ollie across the board. I think for the few that did punt on what was a $14 million asset heading into Saudi Arabia, it was value for money across the board. So an exceptional result for the Brit. And if he is expected to return in Australia in that seat, then I think even $15 million for one more race could really pay dividends. But there's still not a lot to be said yet as to whether Sainz is going to make that triumphant return. So we'll have to wait and see. And, you know, it's very much up in the air at the moment if he's worth another 1 week punt.
Ollie currently sits 10th in the Drivers' Championship standing, so what a really cool thing for him and his dad that we saw in the broadcast to just look up at the end of your first F1 race weekend. Rob, who's your first winner?
I've got Nico Hulkenberg as my first winner. He had 9 points in Saudi Arabia, which on face value doesn't necessarily scream exceptional fantasy production, but he scored the most of all drivers priced below Fernando Alonso, and he also scored more than Norris and Hamilton as well, which I think says something for the kind of value that you're probably getting from a driver like Nico Hülkenberg in a Haas that has demonstrated surprisingly impressive race pace through the first couple of races of the season. It was a very different story 12 months ago. They just didn't seem to really maintain their position because the degradation of that car, tyre degradation of that car, just seemed to dwindle as the race went on. But both Hulkenberg and Magnussen have looked really good so far. And I mean, I will say that perhaps his result was helped a little bit by the train conductor in Kevin Magnussen holding up a quarter of the grid behind him. But a really great start for the Haas team through 2 races, fantasy-wise and otherwise. And I think if his typically strong qualifying performances are able to be maintained, I think at his price, under 7 million, there's a lot of value to be had for Nico Hülkenberg.
You make a great point about value with the budget drivers. You're going to see later what these subtle value gains mean for some of your fantasy upside and some of the new assets you can bring in if you catch these lucky breaks. And Hülkenberg gives us that really great value. He's qualifying high and finishing high, which is unlike anything we saw from him last year. So if Haas can keep this up, I think we have a real lucky budget driver on our hands. And also, we're hearing this week that Hülkenberg is being looked at for a seat at Audi next year. So he's got a lot of reasons to really perform well in the early part of the season. And speaking of teams that are maintaining their tire degradation, my second winner is Ferrari, because they're doing really encouraging work with managing their tire wear this year. They're the second highest scoring constructor once again with 58 points. Is part of that Leclerc's fastest lap, both drivers in the top 10 to finish the race, both drivers into Q3. So a lot of really consistent work from Ferrari, regardless of who's in that second seat. And we're going to discuss a few of the top lineup options later for Albert Park, but let's just say that Ferrari is going to be featured pretty heavily.
Definitely, yeah. I won't spoil too much about what we'll delve into later in the show, but I think they're becoming a very attractive option for several reasons, and there just really isn't another team that stands out to me that's going to rival Red Bull for the podium places at the moment. There's obviously improvement we've seen from McLaren a little bit. Mercedes still don't seem to have their act together quite yet, which you're probably not too happy about. And then there's obviously, the kind of midfield or back market teams, which obviously are not going to get anywhere close to that. So I think Ferrari and Charles Leclerc certainly going to be very hungry to maintain this level of performance and push for those wins that just seemed to escape them last year outside of Singapore.
I will spare you a rant on Mercedes and the delta between their simulated performance and their actual performance, but I'm sure you'll get a long one out of me in the future. Rob, who's your second winner?
I've got Esteban Ocon, which to some people would be quite surprising given the pace of that Alpine would rival a snail in a snowstorm. But quite frankly, the fact that this Alpine is going to consistently fail to get past Q1 from what we've seen so far, I do expect Ocon's going to continue to deliver kind of that 5 to 10 fantasy point performance week in, week out. He's had scores of 7 and 8 to start the season off, qualified 19th in Bahrain and 17th in Saudi Arabia. So you're pretty much looking at a driver that's going to historically start quite well down the order, rely a little bit on that attrition further up the field to make those positions gained. And he is a very experienced driver with that racecraft and awareness that will no doubt serve him well when he is in those tight battles on track. So I've really been impressed from what we've seen from Ocon so far, despite the fact they haven't really been able to get anywhere close to scoring points at the moment. But I do think that is the name of the game. Get a driver in at that budget price bracket or budget adjacent price bracket that's going to not really qualify too well and then score a few points on the race day.
Ocon's another one of these assets like Hülkenberg that if you snuck them into your lineup in these first few races, you got that little bit of budget gain that could wiggle you up to a point where you can afford some really great assets moving forward. So I could see why Ocon would be on your winners list. But if anybody whose eyes are starting to migrate toward my losers list, you'll see in a little bit why I'm not so fond of his teammate. We'll move on to my first loser, and that is once again RB. This team cooked both of us these last 2 weeks, Rob, and I really want to dig into this P14 and P16 finish from a team that really didn't have it going in any part of their race weekend. Yuki was unable to get around that brick wall of Kevin Magnussen throughout that race, even though he was right there in what I thought was going to be a faster car. And Ricciardo was doomed early in the race. He had that 41-second pit stop, but then later in the race, he was all by himself and then spun himself around and then really took himself out of contention to gain any points for those of us that were running him. Meanwhile, this V-Carb team now has 11 total fantasy points on the season, which is behind Williams or Haas. So it's not delivering the value we thought they would give us, and I think it's about time for us to jump ship.
Yeah, I think we'll see a mass exodus of RB owners heading into Australia that, like you and me, held them for just one more week to see if they'd be able to deliver anything remotely respectable in terms of fantasy production, but it just wasn't to be for the second week running. They are a car and a team that strike me as the type that will do quite well in qualifying. They'll more than likely get into Q2, maybe the odd Q3, but their car and their pace just isn't there compared to the Aston Martins and the teams above them, maybe not even the Haas at the moment. So I do worry that even if Yuki and Daniel are qualifying P11, P12, I don't really expect them to make it that much further up the field. And I worry from what the results you've just talked about through the first couple of races is anything to go by. I think that spells a bit of worry for the RB outfit moving forward.
This is going to be such a big week, particularly for Daniel Ricciardo. His upside this season is contending for Checo's seat alongside Max Verstappen on Red Bull, but his downside could be a bounce off the grid because Liam Lawson's hungry to get back on. So this weekend, Daniel Ricciardo is going to his home race, and the site of his first F1 points, he's going to need to deliver for us. Rob, who's your first loser?
You mentioned the terrible slow pit stop of Ricciardo earlier, and Joe was another one prone to something similar in Saudi Arabia. He's my first loser, and it wasn't by any means a bad race for him, to be quite frank. I thought he looked pretty solid. He did pit for new tyres quite late in the race compared to everyone else in the field, but it was partly the fact that the slow pit stop and then just doesn't seem across the board strategy and everything going well for Sauber through two races. Bottas obviously with the similar pit stop conundrum in Bahrain, but the pace of the car is there. I wouldn't say they're an out and out loser, but because of the fact that it seems as though for budget drivers you kind of have to hit 6, 7, 8 points in a race to get a price rise, Joe wasn't able to get to that, and as a result copped a price decrease and was not really there or thereabouts fantasy-wise. So not a great result for him, but I wouldn't discredit him entirely. We know how good he is in the overtakes department, and I think if he can maintain a reasonable performance in Australia, I think he could be back on the menu, but it wasn't a great result for him in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, the weekend was off to a rough start for Joe when he had that crash in FP3. And then it was a race against time to get the car ready in time for Q1. We were all watching the clocks, panning back and forth to the garage. They finally got that car out, but it wasn't enough time to get a flying lap in. So Joe took the -5 for not classifying and qualifying, started P20th, which is I think the only thing that saved the Alpine drivers. And then he had that long pit stop and he was never quite right since. But I agree with you that now that his price has dropped and he's a high overtake driver, I think the next few weeks could be a really good buy low opportunity for Joe.
Definitely. I think he'll come back onto the menu after quite a few people moved off him with that -5, impending -5 in Saudi Arabia. Who's your second loser for Saudi Arabia?
It's Pierre Gasly. And unlike your enthusiasm and optimism about Alpine, I just can't get over how much of that car is a tractor. He's qualified P20 and P18 in his first two races, and he DNF'd this race in the first lap. And I'm worried about what this means for Alpine because reliability has plagued this team really dating back to when Fernando Alonso was on that squad. And I worry about their ability to stay on the track. So yes, they may qualify low and it gives them the opportunity for overtakes, but now I worry about the car staying on the track. And the worst news for Gasly at this point, he's 21st in fantasy scoring and 21st in the Drivers' Championship. That's Nick DeVries numbers.
Yeah, that is bottom of the barrel type stuff right there. I do have to say that the reliability is the one concern I have for Alpine, as you pointed out. It wasn't great last season, although a number of Ocon's DNFs were probably self-inflicted too. But notwithstanding that, it is a car that just hasn't looked anywhere near encouraging through preseason testing in the first two races. So even if they are able to pick up a few positions gained and overtakes, which is what you want from a driver at $6 to $8, $9 million. You don't want the reliability because a -20 for any driver, especially one that's priced in the bargain basement territory, is no means optimal, and reliability and consistency is the name of the game in F1 fantasy. So Gasly has not really looked the part so far.
Speaking of devastating DNFs, Rob, do you want to talk to us about Lance Stroll's weekend?
Yeah, Lance Stroll is my second loser for Saudi Arabia. Just not what we wanted in the second race of the season. Was a -20 for our team, and honestly wasn't too pessimistic about Stroll after free practice and qualifying. He came away with P10 in qualifying, a really good result for a driver that probably needed a bit of a confidence boost, but just seemed to make a meal of things with that crash on, I think it was around lap 8 or lap 9. Just not a great result for him, considering Aston Martin, if they are to fight with Mercedes and McLaren at the moment in the top 5, a DNF is just not what they need, because Fernando Alonso is the driver carrying that team. And for constructor owners in particular, which also attribute the -20s when the driver DNFs, not a great result either for constructor owners there. So I think the ceiling for Aston Martin constructor in particular relies heavily on Stroll, but for Stroll as a driver, I'm just not so sure I'm seeing the level of consistency I was hoping from him through 2 races, particularly because it is a car that can get to Q3 more often than not. So not a great sign so far. What's your take on him now that we're heading into Australia?
I'm trying not to be down on the recent result because it was a very, very difficult DNF for us. There were only 2 drivers that failed to reach the finish line, and those of us that ran them got hurt pretty bad, and that's why we tumbled down in the rankings the way we did. I think Stroll is capable of finishing at the bottom of the top 10 like we saw in Bahrain, like we saw in qualifying. So I think that the promise of him getting there is present, but I'm worried, like you said, about the mental mistakes and the consistency of some of those finishes. I think Aston Martin's going to have to continue to develop the car. That way it gives him a better chance of competing a little bit higher in the top 10. That way, if he has some of these mental struggles, he'll still survive them. But I worry about Stroll, and I think you'll see some of that reflected in our early lineup selections later in the show.
I think as well at 11 million, it's just not value we were hoping to see from him through 2 races. So given there's a number of other tasty options on the menu, both driver and constructor wise, he could be one of the scapegoats with those with a few trades up their sleeve for Australia.
We'll have to see how things go with Lance. And now, without further ado, it's time for the hit list. And a moment ago, you heard me talk about how down I was on Pierre Gasly. I want to talk about the race where Alpine had its darkest moment in 2023, and that's at Albert Park. It was a big DNF week in 2023. There were 8 DNFs at this circuit, which was tied for Qatar for the most on the entire calendar. But this graph that you see here shows the entire weekend of Qatar, including the sprint and the Grand Prix. So Australia stood alone with these 8 DNFs. It was a mess from start to finish. Charles Leclerc beached himself on the first lap. Albon smacked the wall and took himself out. Later in the race, with just 6 laps to go, Magnussen clipped the wall and shot off one of his tires. That triggered a red flag. On the restart, De Vries collided with Sargent, knocked them out. Stroll and Checo went into the gravel. Alonso got spun around. They stopped it, started another. It was another red flag and another restart, and that's when the 2 Alpines collided and took themselves out. So 8 drivers DNF'd in all, and it really made for a huge mess for fantasy owners.
Definitely, yeah. It is a track that, given it's a hybrid street circuit, does attract some risk of driver DNFs. I wouldn't say it is by any means, and not typically the one that we would more than often than not assume or expect a lot of DNFs. But like you said, absolute carnage there last year. There is, a number of sections of the circuit though where you have runoff areas into the gravel, onto the grass. So if drivers do kind of clip the grass here and there, they could spin out quite easily. So I do want to head into this race with drivers on my team that are experienced and reliable, and drivers like you mentioned before, like Stroll, or other drivers like Sargent, are maybe not ones we want in our pockets for this 3rd race week.
I think you hit the nail on the head here. We should proceed with some caution at this circuit and make sure we have drivers that are less prone to mental mistakes. But I wouldn't go so far as to using the autopilot or no negative chip, which we usually use to hedge our bets on tricky race weekends, because I did some research in the preseason that looked at high DNF circuits from 2022 and the correlation last season, and it looks like DNFs tend to ramp up in the second half of the season when these cars start to wear down, when the temperatures get hot. Australia was a huge anomaly in the first half of last season. All of the races on both sides of Australia were only 2 or 3 DNFs. This track didn't yield nearly as many in 2022. So I think it was just all those restarts and the mayhem from them that led to the situation we saw last year.
Yeah, definitely. It isn't, as you say, a track that strikes fear into drivers in terms of DNF risk. So I would expect that to normalize this year. We may only see a couple again, like we saw in years prior, but I'm interested to see whether or not we have any quite carnage like what we saw last season. I can't imagine it's going to be anything close to that, but
I don't know. My heart can't take it again.
Yeah.
And so, Rob, let's not forget about the FanAmp pick of the week this week. The question is, how many drivers will DNF at Albert Park? What do you think?
I've had to go back all the way to 2014 to find 8 DNFs to rival what we had in last year's race. It does, funnily enough, seem to have quite a high DNF rate when you look at it in isolation, despite 3 DNFs in 2022 and 2019. I think we will see a number given the runoff areas, the hybrid street circuit nature of Albert Park, and the fact that I think a lot of teams will be scrapping for points in the midfield. So I'm going to say 4+. What about you?
I'm going to go one south of you and say 3. I think there's going to be just enough, perhaps maybe some cars with reliability issues that would fail early, but not any of the mayhem that we saw last year. So I'm going to go with just 3.
Well, may the best pick win, I suppose.
So as we try to figure out who does typically run well at Albert Park, I wanted to share some fun facts on recent races. So Nico Hülkenberg was one of Rob's winners from earlier in the show, and he's only competed in this race twice since 2019, but he finished P7 both times on 2 different teams. So maybe Hulk is one of these budget drivers that can keep it on the track and deliver a surprisingly good result. Rob told you earlier that Haas is doing a better job maintaining its tires than ever before, so I really like Hülkenberg in this race. Meanwhile, Valtteri won this race with Mercedes in 2019. Albert Park didn't have a race in 2020 and 2021 due to COVID, but he took P8 in his first season with Alfa Romeo in 2022 and survived the carnage to finish P11 last year. So 2 cheap drivers that have recent success here, Rob.
Yeah, I think particularly encouraging for a driver like Bottas and owners as well that have not really been rewarded at all through 2 races, myself included. He's had 0 in Bahrain and -1 in Saudi Arabia. A lot of that, again, boils down to the lack of strategy or such that Sauber have suffered from through 2 races. So I definitely expect a bounce back performance. He's an adopted Australian as well. Not that that means much for fantasy production. And I think at 6 million, the only driver less than that is Sargent. I'm not going to start screaming to the heavens that Valtteri Bottas is value for money, but he does bring a sense of experience and reliability to fantasy. And I think that, for me, is something I value extremely highly. So if he is able to get close to a points finish in a car that is middling, but I think on his day he can drive that quite well, I wouldn't be surprised if we see another top 10 from him this Sunday.
I don't know if you saw it, Rob. There are some posters in Melbourne this week that have 3 drivers. It's Piastri, Ricciardo, and Valtteri on it. So he really is the adopted son of Australia, which is great. So now as we look for some of the best budget drivers on the team, I want to flip the script and talk about the top half of the lineup, because due to some lucky bounces with those budget drivers and gaining some cost cap, there are now teams that can afford the trio of Verstappen, Red Bull, and Ferrari. So if you have $105.8 million or more, due to some of these lucky breaks, the Ferrari drivers, Ocon, Magnussen, Hülkenberg, you too can afford a really powerful lineup, because these 3 assets alone scored 220 or more points in the first 2 races. Rob, I think the field's going to really start to spread out with this lineup.
I definitely think so. There has, as you mentioned, been a number of teams that have been fortunate enough to rise those price increases. You and me rooted with RB, perhaps not so much, but I think it's in a matter of weeks, we will probably migrate towards a Verstappen, Red Bull and Ferrari meta or template. I do think the very few that can get to a team like that right away, I would highly recommend it. I think the upside is tremendous. But it does seem for the majority of us a race or 2 further away once we can capture a couple more price increases from those value for money assets that you've talked about. So I think it is exciting that there is a template developing, but as I've pointed out a couple of times already, even though it might have an element of boredom to it where everyone has similar teams, it is also a template or a meta lineup for a reason. It's because they score the most points. And I think from what we've seen from Red Bull and Ferrari through 2 races, I think that's kind of the pick for a lot of us heading into Australia.
I think for the rest of us, like you and I, that can't afford it, the big question for this week is how do you get as close to that output as possible? And I'm proposing the diet meta team, which is use either Sergio Perez or Charles Leclerc as your 2x DRS boost. Have Red Bull and Ferrari to get as many of those points from your constructors as possible, and then just fill your team with the best possible budget drivers. Are you looking at that as a possible option for you as a way to get out of RB this week, or do you see other alternatives to try to build that cost cap?
I think I want to play what's in front of me at the moment, and from what Perez and Leclerc have delivered in 2 races, I know the podiums have been copy-paste for Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, but I like to be reassured by the results we've seen so far, and Ferrari and Red Bull are far and away the best 2 constructors to own. I don't want to take too much of a punt on that 2 times DRS boost slot, so I think Perez and Leclerc do speak to me as the most reliable and proven commodities in that price bracket. There are also alternatives in Sainz, in Hamilton, in Norris, but I want to wait until I see a bit more from Hamilton and Norris, for instance, before I suddenly start using them in that DRS boost slot. So for now, it's probably going to be a Perez or a Leclerc, unless there's something drastic we see in practice that throws us off entirely.
You had hinted at something that's a great segue to the next topic, and that is, could Carlos Sainz be a good 2x DRS boost driver if he makes this triumphant return? Because the fastest we've seen a driver return from an appendectomy is Alex Albon 2 years ago. He was back in the car in 3 weeks and was heralded as a hero. If Sainz comes back after 2 weeks, that would be pretty historic. And so I think now all he has to do is finish in the top 7 or 8 like Behrman did last week, and he could get driver of the day, and times 2, that would be 20 points right off the bat, and he's in a Ferrari. I wonder if Sainz could be a sneaky pick at the 2x boost, because he does give you that extra $1.5 million, $2 million to spread to the budget drivers and maybe make them better too.
Definitely. I think there is a lot to be said for Carlos Sainz. He had that tremendous result in Bahrain, 36 points, second among all drivers. And at that price point of 18, 19 million, I think you're really getting bang for your buck there. Unfortunately, given his premium price tag or premium adjacent price tag, it's hard to fill your squad with anyone else that's even remotely reliable outside of maybe budget drivers. Of course, assuming you're going for Red Bull, Ferrari or something like that. But he does, as you mentioned, have the upside of driver of the day. He had that in Bahrain. Ollie had that in Saudi Arabia. So if they are looking like another decent shot at a podium, I wouldn't be surprised if they do a clean sweep for the first 3 races.
Now, if Sainz isn't in the car and Ollie runs it back again, I see a lot of upside to him on the grid and what he can do to earn a seat in 2025, but I still don't quite have a place for him in my fantasy lineup. He's cheap enough where he doesn't quite make sense as the 2x driver compared to options like Leclerc or Perez, but he's also not cheap enough that we can run one of those top 2x drivers and Behrman in the same lineup without sacrificing the constructors. So I'm not sure I'd run Ollie as an individual driver, but regardless of who's in the car, I'm totally sold on Ferrari this week.
Definitely, yeah. I think I do just like the Ferrari constructor in that sense, because you get Leclerc and then you get a clip of Ollie as well. And I think if he has the potential to score points again, I think that's an easy 15, 20 point performance right there for him. He had 15 points, 16 points without driver of the day, and that's still very good value for a rookie driver fantasy wise. So I've got one eye on the Ferrari constructor for that very reason. And it's going to take a lot from me to not go in that direction, regardless of who's in that second car of Sainz or Behrman come the weekend.
Rob, when you were scrolling through some of the 2x candidates, you mentioned Lewis Hamilton, and he's an intriguing person to talk about because even though he was in the discussion when we were trying to pick our biggest bust, he just fell off the list. But there were 3 F1 TV pundits that ran Lewis Hamilton in Jeddah. It was James Hinchcliffe, Will Buxton, and friend of the show, Chris McCarthy. They all ran the 7-time world champion. What do you think about Lewis as a 2x driver this week?
I mean, Had you asked me what do you think of Lewis as a driver this weekend, I probably still would be asking questions. But Lewis as a 2X driver, I'm not really going to entertain at all. There's not been much at all that I've seen from him through 2 races. Obviously, I pointed out earlier he didn't have a great showing in Saudi Arabia with only 6 points, and he only had double that in Bahrain. So you're not seeing something tangible from him through 2 races as a fantasy asset alone, let alone a 2 times DRS boost option to even consider it, especially when you've got Leclerc, Perez, even the emerging McLaren in Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, who had P4 in Saudi Arabia and 23 points to go along with that. There's just so many other options at that price point that has really deterred me from wanting to entertain Lewis Hamilton. I'd want to see more, not just from him, but from Mercedes as a whole. And it just doesn't seem as though they've got the car at a position where it's going to be semi-competitive at the moment, at least for podiums. So I think it's a wait and see for Mercedes entirely. Give them 2, 3, 4 more races. Maybe come, Japan, China, we might see a little bit more from them. But right now, it's not a driver I've even given the slightest amount of thought to. What's your take on what I would say is your favorite driver at the moment of all time?
He's off to a tough start this season for sure. George Russell scored 35 fantasy points, Lewis just 18. He's outside the top 10 in total scoring for drivers in F1 fantasy, so I'm worried about Lewis. And Mercedes is already starting to point to upgrades at Imola, which gives me a sense that they don't feel confident in that car for these next few races. So I think, like we had talked about earlier in the show, there are just more safe drivers for that 2X spot. And with that, we had a discussion with Chris about starting with his team from Jeddah that featured Lewis in the 2X spot, and what are some candidates he could bring in to really improve his odds of jumping up the F1 live standings this week in Australia. Take a look. Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula. Rob and I are here with the lead commentator for Formula 3 and Porsche Super Cup, who's back for his second season of F1 Kids. It's none other than Chris McCarthy. Chris, are you ready to review your team?
I am. Let's do it. Let's do it.
All right, so this is your team from Jeddah. Can you talk us through your team selection and some of the pros and cons you felt coming out of the race?
I mean, pros definitely. Constructors, Red Bull, top 2 really. I think Red Bull are 1-2. Ferrari. I was tempted to take them out when Ollie got swapped in. I'll be honest, and put McLaren in. But I think Ollie did really well coming through the field. So I kept my faith in him, having seen him throughout the years. And I think that probably just about paid off. So yeah, I was very happy with how that one played out. Negatives, Gasly. I mean, I was on the fence of putting Ocon in instead, and I wish I had now because I lost a lot of points there. I did swap in Magnussen mainly because I thought he'd come through the field, and I think that worked. But yeah, Lewis Hamilton. I was going to put in Checo for Hamilton, and yeah, probably should have done that.
Yeah, I actually made the same transfer in Saudi Arabia to bring in Kevin Magnussen for the reasons you've just mentioned, but it's tough to stomach when a decision that you'd think goes relatively well, like K-Mag, is obviously offset by a DNF by Pierre Gasly, for instance. So yeah, a bit of a mixed bag for both of our teams in Saudi Arabia. Are there any kind of fires that you'd want to put out in Australia that's come to mind for you?
It's the main one is what do I do with Lewis Hamilton? I guess I believe I should probably put in Checo Perez, but then I'm on the fence. I think the top driver needs to be replaced now. I've given Lewis 2 races, but it's who do I replace him with? I guess because Checo's doing well, but he's one of those drivers, isn't he? That sometimes he can have like a couple of good races and then his form can die off sometimes if we go off previous seasons. So yeah, it's what do we do? I mean, the car's looking so strong this year, though. It might just continue as is, to be fair. So yeah, what do you think, guys?
I've got 2 ideas queued up. Feel free to use as much
or
little of it as you'd like.
So
if you wanted to move Perez in, the only way you could afford him would be to move on from Danny Rick to either Valtteri or Logan. So you're taking on a little bit of risk at the bottom of your lineup, but you do get Perez back in that 2X spot. The alternative would be to bring in Charles as your 2X driver and then swap Ricciardo for his teammate Tsunoda, keeping the bottom 3 drivers as they are. So some food for thought, all within your budget.
Okay. So, right, okay. I'm thinking have a look at this now. I'm pulling up my team, guys. I'm filling up my team.
I think that the luxury we have, as has been the case the last couple of seasons, is that we do get 2 free transfers every single week. So,
Yeah.
you can easily, as Adam's pointed out, pull out Lewis and someone else. And you've probably, in that case, cleaned out a bit of deadwood in Lewis and Ricardo potentially, or Gasly, if you're looking at eyeing off at least 2 of those guys. Because I think Magnussen and Albon are both pretty sound picks, and I don't imagine you want to touch the constructors.
No, I think Magnussen and Albon are good. It's just the other 3, I guess, which ones come out and which ones stay. So we think Hamilton comes out.
As much as I love Mercedes, I'm worried about them in the short term. You heard Toto Wolff come out at the end of last week talking about the correlation between their simulation activities and what they're seeing on track. That makes me a little uneasy. Plus some of the comments from Lewis after the race about him feeling uneasy in the car compared to George. It makes me worry about his short-term prospects.
Yeah. I'm pulling up my team as we speak, guys.
Now, feel free. You don't have to make these moves right now. We've got all the way up until the start of qualifying to lock in your team. So remember, this time last week, anybody that locked in Carlos Sainz to their team was in a bit of trouble when he had the last minute emergency exit. So feel free to take that space up.
I'll keep them in mind. But yeah, so it's Lewis Hamilton out, is it? What was the suggestion there again?
I think either Hamilton and Ricardo out for Perez and Bottas or Sargent, or Hamilton and Ricardo out for Leclerc and Yuki.
That's a good shout. I think I was thinking of bringing Bottas in anyway, so I think that could be a.
I'm curious to see if Sam Collins in the tech corner has any updates on the RB, or if anyone else on the list on the left-hand side does have a point of view on upgrades that some of these teams might be bringing in the next few weeks that make them more competitive.
Yeah, no, that's very true. That's very true.
And Chris, if we can bestow any advice on you, I know there are a few people in the table, including Alex at number 1, that have already used the 3X DRS boost chip. Word of advice that we give our viewers: save that chip for a sprint race, because in the sprint race, you're going to score points over 3 events. Let's triple up all those points instead of doing that on a regular race weekend like this one.
Okay. I think Alex just wanted to see his name at the top of the list, to be honest. I think that's all he wanted.
It was funny. I posted the latest F1 live table, and 30 seconds later, Alex reposted it. So he loves being number 1. Good for him.
I think he just wanted to see his name at the top of the list for a couple of weeks. All right, guys. I'm making this, guys. I'm gonna do this on air because I appreciate this advice. Right, Bottas is going in for Ricardo, and Perez is going in with the 2 times boost. I think that is a solid choice.
There you have it, folks. A live transfer. You don't see too many of those on our streams these days.
There you go. It's happened.
That's amazing. Chris, your team is calling for support, and we are here for you.
We have it. It's done. We're locked in for Australia.
Chris, do you have any other questions on the fantasy game? Anything Rob and I can help?
I mean, it's just the chips, I guess. I what do they all mean? I guess I don't really know. Sort of what were the rest?
That's where we come in. Adam's obviously got his F1FantasyHQ.com website that sets out all of the chips and the optimal times to use them, and I'm F1 Fantasy Hub over on YouTube, so I have videos that you can obviously watch in your own time as well. That'll hopefully give you some advice on when to deploy those chips.
I will take this week to have a look through those with my dad, definitely.
That's fantastic. Chris, thanks so much again for coming on with us. We had a fantastic interview with you earlier. Can't wait to see how you make out this week.
Thank you very much for your time, guys. Really appreciate it. And my bet's looking strong now. My bet's looking strong for Australia.
Fantastic.
Thanks very much. Cheers,
Chris
guys.
McCarthy, everybody. Thank you very much again.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
And there you have it. We set history with our first ever special guest locking in their lineup before the weekend preview. Lewis and Ricardo came out of Chris's lineup. We put in Checo with the 2x DRS boost and Valtteri into his lineup. So I'm really excited to see how this is going to play out this week.
Yeah, it's super exciting. We finalized the team live on stream, which we ordinarily wouldn't recommend you and I do until we've seen pre-practice results. But it is the lineup you have to beat this weekend. And given it was you and I that provided advice to Chris on how his team was set up for Australia, it would be quite ironic if you were beaten by your own advice you gave to him.
As an optimist, I'll say I'm either right or I'm right. So either way, I'm rooting for me. But in all seriousness, I hope I beat Chris this week. Otherwise, he's going to have some serious bragging rights moving forward. That's all for our show this week, but a special announcement about our live show this Friday. With the Australian Grand Prix kicking off in the middle of the night in North America, Rob and I are going to change our time for the live show to 5 p.m. Eastern. That allows our guests in North America and Europe to join us live on the show, and for anyone that wants to wait and set their lineup right before qualifying, you can watch us while the rest of us are in bed. So please make sure you set your alarms for 5 p.m. Eastern this Friday, and we'll see you there.